Howdy. I heard you was looking for Tim Rogers. Yeah, that's me. This here's Kotaku. Now, wherever it is I'm from, people talk about how at the end of it all, right there at the ultimate moment, a man is either red, dead, or redeemed. Now, if you want, I can tell you about a man who might have been all three. Before most of the people who wound up turning into people who told other people stories about other people made his acquaintance, this man named John Marston got his face cut up into 3 strips of hamburger steak by I ain't never met nobody knows what, probably a saber-toothed tiger if they had those back around then. Then he done fell down some stairs, chin first, into maybe a nest some rats was making out of their own fur. Well, he hadn't done a lot of good in his life, or what good he had done hadn't been enough to balance the bad, so some lawmen bought him a train ticket out to a place what you and I'd call no place in particular, sending him on some mission or another. He rode in the passenger car of that old bumpy hot locomotive a whole day and another day to go with it, listening to the idle conversing's of the pampered rich. There was these 2 old ladies talking like they owned this country, like it was a thing somebody could just up and own. Marston got where he was going, and he didn't have 2 seconds to spare to spend in a saloon, so he got right to business. A man there took him out to Fort Mercer to try and wrangle up this outlaw named Bill Williamson, whose mother might have called him William Williamson, who some say the rebels down in Mexico at that time called Guillermo Hijo de Guillermo. Well, Marston thought talking to Bill could accomplish something, and he was wrong about that because he got shot right in the meat of his manly body. It turned out Marston's friend must have alerted a kindly woman named Bonnie McFarlane because she paid a doctor $15 to get that hot disaster out of Marston's torso. As soon as Marston was able to breathe without sleeping, she tells him he can do some work around her ranch to pay back that $15. Now, John had been a bandit and an outlaw and a bank robber, and he'd shot and killed men before. He'd even shot several horses right in the head. However, he wasn't no kind of jerk, so he helped Bonnie around the ranch. He shot and killed some garden variety hungry rabbits, and he herded up some cattle, and he stopped some of them same cattle from stampeding off a cliff when some lightning spooked them. He entertained the charming lady with a race about the ranch. He drove her wagon into town one day with her riding shotgun. One dusty night, they went out with a rowdy crew and wrangled up and tamed some wild horses. One of them was a mean stallion, and after a struggle, Marston tamed it, and when I say after a struggle, I mean after a struggle. Bonnie told him he could keep that stallion for his trouble, and to hear her tell it later, it was around then that they started to become mighty good friends. At first, she had argued with him that he was quiet simply because he didn't have anything interesting to say, and he'd agreed with her, though once they'd understood the idea of one another, he told her he had a wife and a boy who were off somewhere nobody knew at the time, and that he'd come to this part of the world to kill a wanted man. Bonnie told Marston if he wanted to know about a wanted man, he could try asking the marshal in Armadillo. Marshal Johnson was a good man with a good enough excuse for having not already exterminated Bill Williamson, which was Bill Williamson had taken up residence in the next county. The marshal said he had his hands full, and Marston maybe saw this as an opportunity to prove himself superior to authority, because that very same day he volunteered to help the marshal blast the tarnation out of some stagecoach robber's kneecaps. Then he rode up to Pike's Basin with the marshal and his boys, and together they sent some no-good murdering cattle rustlers off to God's jail. Now, the marshal had said he didn't think highly of government interference in law enforcement, and Marston protested that he was of similar mind on the matter, and despite their initial disagreements, the marshal saw Marston's spirit was good, and thus he agreed to help him in his righteous endeavor. Just having the marshal's promise of his guns and his men would not suffice for shattering Williamson's fort, so Marston required additional assistance. Chance had it that one night out on the prairie, Marston's path intertwined with that of a bizarre old man named Nigel West Dickens, whose stagecoach had crashed on the side of a dirt road. West Dickens was injured, so Marston took the reins and got the old man to a doctor. Later, Marston assisted in the hawking of narcotic beverage wares to a crowd the old swindler had described as unsuspecting plebeians. Heck, Marston even protected the old man's corporal pride against some varmints who claimed the secret drink was, in fact, nothing more than useless snake oil. Inexplicably, Marston even agreed to race horses for this incomprehensible human being and share the profits with him. Twice. Maybe Marston helped West Dickens because he knew the drink he had imbibed had in fact imparted some value in empowering his ability to aim a pistol, or maybe he only helped this particular individual because some speck of a notion in the back of his mind saw that enclosed windowless stagecoach's potential usefulness in some kind of a plan involving subterfuge. West Dickens spoke a lot of words, and Marston didn't want to hear most of them. When West Dickens mentioned an acquaintance who had knowledge of the whereabouts of a machine gun, well, Marston had never heard of a machine gun before, nor could he even conceive of what one was, yet something deep in his heart knew he had to have it. Marston took a detour from his pursuit of this machine gun to meet a man named Seth. Seth dug up dead bodies and talked to them. Seth said he possessed both the willingness and the ability to help Marston conquer Williamson, and maybe Marston believed him. I don't know, because he helped him with the exhuming of some corpses and the seeking of some treasure. What Seth ended up doing to help, I never met no one who even thinks they can remember. Well, it was this man from Ireland with the creative pseudonym Irish who knew about the machine gun. When Marston met Irish was on the verge of receiving a murder from a Welshman and a Frenchman. Irish told Marston he knew where to find the machine gun, and Marston believed him, which he probably should not have done. As the indirect result of Irish's misinformation, Marston did commit a grisly atrocity unto several bodies of ambitious humans. It turned out that machine gun was elsewhere, so Marston trusted Irish again, this time following him into a mine, inside of which of course lurked many men who considered themselves Irish's enemies. Marston blasted several souls into a colder dimension in pursuit of the machine gun, which Irish had called an executive peacemaker. Now, I just want to reiterate that Marston had never so much as pointed his left eye at one of these machine guns before, so he was more surprised than you or I'd have been that the thing needed special ammunition. Well, Marston caught Irish making a mockery of some terrified nuns and persuaded the fellow to abandon whatever it was he was pursuing and instead come along and commit multiple murders in pursuit of some ammunition for this very special firearm. Now that he'd got a big gun, the ammunition to fire out of that gun, and an opaque coach to hide it in, Marston went calling on the marshal. Well, the marshal needed Marston's help to investigate some chilling activity in the vicinity, so they rode out, glimpsed some vultures, found some corpses not too far from those vultures, and followed the trail of sickness up to a farm where some bandits had holed themselves up with some hostages. What followed was a bloodbath, though it might be you know what they say, at least blood is warm. It turned out those bandits were with Bill Williamson's crew. Well, Bill Williamson did not wish to surrender from atop a ridge where he had the high ground, so him and Marston and Marshal Johnson's men fought for a while instead. Now, the next day, before Marston and the marshal could saddle up and take down Williamson's fort, Bonnie McFarlane asks Marston to help her find her father. The old man found some dead cowboys out on the frontier and was seeing to showing them some respect. While Marston and Bonnie were outside the ranch, some bandits saw fit to set Bonnie's barn on fire, so Marston helped her get the horses out. Afterward, she told Marston he'd saved her ranch and she owed him a great debt and all that, though all he said he wanted in return was the opportunity that she sell him some cattle when he got his life back together at a later date. So Marston was on his way back to the marshal thinking finally he was going to get Williamson, and it turned out that the marshal was just headed out on his way to stop some bandits from hanging and killing Bonnie McFarlane. It seemed that at some point between Marston saving Bonnie's horses and his making his way to Armadillo, bandits had both kidnapped Bonnie McFarlane and sent a ransom note to the marshal. If I were Marston, here's around where I would have marveled at the sheer velocity of these outlaws. I would have shuddered, put in, gave up, and pointed my pony northward out of this United States and Nightmerica and straight flush into Canada. Well, maybe John had more grit than me, and he just wasn't gonna let Bonnie die anyway other than of old age, so he killed a couple more times, and he probably figured it wasn't going to be the last time he was going to kill. Now John Marston and the marshal and his snake oil selling friend and their wagon and their machine gun and that other fellow, whatever his part was, they showed up at Fort Mercer and executed a modern-day Trojan horse maneuver. John Marston waited in that little cramped wagon for the old-timer's signal, and it might have been something changed in him while he was in there, alone with that brutal piece of metal. Here I just want to reiterate again, John Marston had never seen no machine gun before, nor had he ever touched one. So here he was alone with that monstrosity, and something changed right down to his microscopic fibers. Here was a weapon he'd been born to wield. When the old man flung open the door, John Marston opened fire with that long-distance meat grinder, and he sent 77 souls downstairs before you and I could breathe twice. Thus expunged of life, the good doers searched for Williamson. Well, Williamson had gone to Mexico. Marston got on a raft piloted by an idiot across the river to Mexico, and it might have just so happened that he killed many more people during his time on that raft alone than you or I will likely kill in the last 10 years of our lives combined. Mexico didn't remind Marston of any particular place he hadn't already ridden a horse and shot idiots, except for it had palm trees, less harmonica, and more trumpets than was to his liking in their folk music. In the town of Chuparosa, Marston failed to make friends with 3 citizens, and thereafter met a man named Landon Ricketts. Marston had heard stories about about Ricketts the same way you and I have heard stories about Marston. So, two subjects of retold escapades made one another's acquaintance, and the elder chided the younger, which is how these stories about stories go, and the elder went ahead and imparted a sort of technical pedagogy on the younger via some lesson on the subject of shooting bottles off a wall. Marston remained in Ricketts' acquaintance for a short while down there in Mexico. Ricketts told Marston he ran Chuparosa, and maybe he did if by running a town you mean playing poker with a group of men who are all going to be dead by your indirect action before dawn. It might be Marston saw one possible future of himself in the old man, which is the case maybe, or maybe should be, whenever a young man looks at an old man. Ricketts had run away from something. That much Marston could tell from how little the man belonged anywhere, that he could have been running away from anything. Probably he was running away from his own inability to stay out of other people's trouble. Marston rode the train with Ricketts towards some other people's trouble, and they made that trouble their own trouble. They murdered a lot of what Ricketts had called clothed vermin. They rescued a good woman named Louisa. Louisa was a vibrant young idealist. Not content to being helped just once by some bona fide storybook heroes, Louisa came around and asked the men's help in intercepting some political prisoners. This is how Marston got involved in the revolution. Ricketts parted ways with Marston here. Ricketts said to Marston that he might want to exercise some caution when jumping over a fence, because sooner or later he might get impaled on it. All Marston really knew for sure about the revolution was that a revolution was happening. Ricketts had maybe projected a little bit too much philosophy into his warning about jumping over a fence. If you'd asked the rebels or the army, either of them had told you Marston was playing both sides, though if you'd ever known Marston, you'd have known he only had one side, and that was his own side. All he wanted was this Javier Escuela and Bill Williamson, and whoever could help him find those men was on his side, if only for that moment. So Marston rode with his lunatic military man to Santa, and he shot and killed rebels who were trying to hijack a locomotive. Then on the other side of the fence, Marston employed vehicular manipulation skills unseen and unheard of and unimaginable and unexpectable at that time in history by even the most creative scientist living, as he escorted rebel Luisa's fragile little sister over the river and out of the way of the harm of the war. Then the very next day, all the army had to do was so much as mention Escuela's name, and Marston followed them into a purgatory that swiftly slipped into the tarnation of atrocity. The army burned down 3 houses that day, and Marston didn't ask why. Marston rode with DeSanta to what he was told was a rebel stronghold at Torquemada, and he helped the army soldiers take it by slaughtering force. DeSanta didn't have any more information about Escuela, and Marston wasn't educated quite enough in the mathematic sciences to count how many rebels and innocents died that day. A day later, Marston jumped to the other side of the fence and at Luisa's behest infiltrated the Mexican army prison El Presidio to stop the execution of the rebel leader Reyes. Louisa, again being an idealist, was in love with the man, as maybe most ladies were back in those days. Marston didn't like Reyes, or heck, I'll say I can't see why he would have, or how he could have. Some tiny lurking political genius in the back of Marston's skull might have inspired him to help the man because a revolution needs a leader, and conventional wisdom has it that more juice comes out of a fruit if you squeeze it harder. The next day, DeSanta asked Marston to defend a train bearing military necessaries. He said he'd bring Marston Escuela on a silver platter immediately afterward. Well, the mission was a sham. Right here's where Marston most likely realized that the military for certain did not like or appreciate him. They had intended him to die right there on the train. The army must have expected Marston to curl right up and pass away at 82 miles per hour. That's how fast trains could go back then, the maximum of about 82 miles per hour, by the way. Few men have the occasion to reckon the velocity of their corpse at the moment of their passing. Well, Marston did have that opportunity, and I'm not going to say he dawdled on it. The swiftness of the interval with which he considered velocity, wrestle, and mortality was such that it might not have even occurred at all. In the space of time it'd take you or I to blink an eye, Marston unfolded his preternaturally clenched fist and touched the cold, evil metal of that machine gun. See, the Mexican army might have figured Marston for the sort of fellow who'd have looked at a machine gun and presumed it to be some sort of a casually inert, useless object, wrought of trash iron for no purpose other than to put shame on an engineer's legacy. Well, Marston's life experience immediately preceding that point had shown him more useful opinions than that. If any of them rebels had survived with enough tongue left in their jaw to tell a tale of what they saw, they might have said Marston was a magician with that machine gun. Though to Marston it wasn't nothing supernatural, it was as natural as breathing. All Marston needed to turn those idealistic horseback riders' hopes and dreams into just as much much hamburger was the cold eyes a humorless god had given him, and a single index finger not lacking one unbroken bone. Any man with an ordinary capacity for hardship might have counted his survival among his blessings and eschewed any aspect of the Mexican army after an encounter like that one. Though like I've been telling you, Marston weren't no ordinary man. DeSanta told Marston the army had taken Escuela prisoner and were willing to hand him over to Marston and the U.S. Federals, and given their record as regarded the truthful reporting of facts, and given his own record of behaving as an insincere man, Marston expressed doubts as to his companion's sincerity. I don't want to believe Marston was a fool, so I'm going to say he went along with the ruse simply because he wanted a clean excuse to wake up, kill, and hate the Mexican army officers with his gun. Right around then's when Marston turned into what any historian concerned with the barest of facts would consider a full-time revolutionary. It all happened real fast after that. Turned out when a man like Marston stuck with one side rather than flip-flopping back and forth between both, it turned the tide. The rebels utilized subterfuge to destroy a precious military caravan with hidden dynamite. They ambushed DeSanta in a windy graveyard on a hot afternoon. They interrupted an execution with gunfire of their own. They gave DeSanta a chance at redemption, and DeSanta gave them a lead on Escuela. Marston felt the voice of God wash over him, saying, "You can kill this man who wronged you, or you can let these other men he wronged kill him." Some storytellers say he shot DeSanta without blinking. Some say he walked away. I like to think he walked away. By now, Marston knew his way around a train. He helped the rebels hijack some military supply. Military wasn't too happy about it, though. Maybe if they hadn't wanted Marston to do what he was going to be famous for doing, they shouldn't have left that mechanized blaster mounted on the car behind the engine. Marston gritted his teeth and wreaked such a loud carnage nobody nowadays can argue that the groundwater didn't run red for a month or more after that. Some men in uniform resisted the pillage, though as Marston had learned, clothes didn't change the ease with which a shotgun hamburgerized an officer, same as it did a rabbit. Marston became so attuned to the rhythm of the killing that into his body had somehow seeped an ease to fall asleep on even a wagon full of dynamite. He couldn't tell the dream from the nightmare in those days. Etched on the back of his eyelids, he saw a sky the color of man's inhumanity to man, and he saw his own inhumanity perpetrated onto himself. They were crunching up a prison where Escuela might certainly have been, and their plans, as rebels' plans do, relied on explosions and luck. And luck was lucky, and Marston found Escuela, who didn't like being found. Marston could have killed him, though I've heard that a man living in the past will keep the past alive just to have somebody to talk to about something they have in common. He gave the old varmint over to the U.S. Federals at the border and then chased a tip about Williamson. Williamson had chosen his side in the Mexican Revolution, and it was the Army's side. Though like Marston had fallen on the rebels' side, that was nothing more than chance's doing. Really, they was each on the sides of their own self. The rebels had struck in their desperation. Louisa got her wish to live on in history. Marston rescued the rebel leader, and they shot up the colonel's stronghold. I'd say it was indecent to bathe such beautiful country in blood under such brilliant daylight, though maybe you'd want to define for me what in tarnation was decent in those days. The colonel offered up Williamson in exchange for his own life, though when you bargain with killers, you don't so easily choose what your own life is worth. Reyes killed the colonel with a sort of a mismatched idiot's rhythm, and to compensate for the hole punched through time, Marston transformed Williamson's head into a dead man's head. Reyes urged Marston to stay behind in Mexico to spectate the escalation of a new promise. But Marston didn't see the point of it. He told Reyes to remember why he wanted the power he'd won, and we all know how that goes with men who win power. You know what they say about how hard it is for an old habit to die, and well, Marston had accidentally tried to steal a stagecoach instead of ride it as a passenger. It's almost like the choice was the flip of a coin for him, or like there was two buttons under his thumb and he pressed one on accident when he could have just as easily pressed the other. Marston got chewed out a bit by the local law and spent 2 nights in a Mexican jail, and after that the stagecoaches weren't too eager to stop for him. So he saddled up his old horse and he set out into the hot, bright desert for a long ride up and out of Mexico, across the border, through the territory, and up into the city of Blackwater to report his works being done to the Federals who held his life and his wife hostage. Now, during the whole inhumane length of that ride, the screaming sun in palpable contempt for the nakedest notion of mercy, didn't set once in what felt like a week. The heat of the sun being a regular problem as it is on a normal day, and being a vicious torture south of the border, this long hot ride's arduosity was thus such that you or I'd need no significant experience with animal husbandry to declare it brimming with lethality for even the steadiest stallion. John Marston rode that horse with icy equicide in his blood. Why, I'd say if that beast had had half the wit God gave a grubby gremlin, or any weaselly fraction of the wherewithal to speak words like a man might, he'd have piped up before the first snap of the reins, begging that his master serve his next meal post-haste, and hot from the carbon steel barrel of that fine Winchester. Life and the weather were different up in Blackwater, though men killed and died much the same. Now, the biggest fundamental difference in that city up north was that the killers wore fancier clothes, and thought that their reasons for killing were more righteous, by simple virtue of their being more complicated. Nothing probably could surprise a man like John Marston at this point, so when his federal handlers declared that they weren't done profiting from his knack for ending life, well, that didn't surprise him neither. Marston thought the deal was just for Williamson and Escuela, though now the Federals wanted Dutch, the leader of the gang. On the way out of the police office, Marston saw Wes Dickens being escorted to the jail for narcotic possession, and though he didn't have to say a word, he did. He said Wes Dickens had helped him, and the Federals believed it, and they let the man go. They rode in a horseless buggy out to a riverboat that had run aground some years before. They fought off some rascals and rescued one of Dutch's stragglers, a man named Nastus. Marston didn't like the horseless buggy much, and his dislike found cause when the fool thing collapsed into uselessness en route back to the office. Perhaps now, Marston detested all vehicles, even animals that sufficed for such. To hear Marston tell of it, Dutch had been like a brother until he started killing without reason. It had seemed to a storyteller that as civilization devised new comforts, Dutch's contempt for that progress expanded in proportion. He and his men terrorized Blackwater regularly, and during Marston's time in Blackwater, Dutch's gang robbed a bank there. In keeping with his legal obligation, Marston assisted the Federals, and his bad luck brought him face to face with Dutch. Their conversation was not friendly. Dutch referred in rude words to his former intimate knowledge of Marston's wife Abigail, mother of Marston's son Jack. Between yells of gunfire, Dutch also called the Federals Marston's masters, a notion Marston rejected. He said, "I've been my own master since you left me to die." Dutch got away, and the Peacemaker posse gave pursuit. Them Federals expressed disdain regarding Marston's hesitation. They insinuated that he might not have hated Dutch quite enough to pull a trigger, and Marston took grave offense to their doubt, adding that he'd shoot them Federals even 100 times each if it was a choice. Dutch's man Nastus took Marston up to scout Dutch's camp in the mountains. A bear accosted Marston during the climb, and Marston wasn't about to abandon the opportunity to send that monster back to the devil from the safety of a crow's nest. He spied an eagle halfway up to the summit, and he put that eagle away too. Marston encountered a door leading to the camp, forged in some wood impervious to all bullets, and for a loud while Marston questioned the density of whatever nightmare gripped him. Just as Marston spied Dutch's location, Dutch sharp shot the binoculars out of his hand. I wonder why he did that. I wonder why he would let the man who would kill him live. Oh well. In Blackwater, Marston made the acquaintance of a racist professor from Connecticut named McDougal. McDougal wanted to study the natives, so he studied Dutch's man Nastus for a while. Nastus offered to take McDougal and Marston to meet some of his friends. Marston went along looking for clues that'd get him into Dutch's stronghold. A bear roared at him in the road, and the nightmare tightened its grasp on Marston's skull as his gun vanished from his hands. Without a rifle in front of that bear, Marston was about as useful as a naked man in a clothes-wearing contest. Somehow he persevered. Nastus's native friends did him in, prompting MacDougal to prepare to leave town for good. Well, the natives didn't want MacDougal to leave town anyway other than as ashes on the wind, so they bust into Blackwater, and they was in no mood to be kind. During the ensuing chaos, MacDougal declared, "They're savages," prompting Marston to declare, louder than gunfire, that he reckoned we all were. Marston was about to see how right he was, because now the Federals and the army were ready to move on Dutch's stronghold. They had what they called a prototype vehicle, covered in plates of armor thick enough to stop 100 bullets if it had to, with a mechanized gun on its back. The outlaws managed to flip the vehicle like it was any other wagon, so the peacemakers went the rest of the way on horseback. Federals, army, police, and Marston, they were a strange mix of walks of lives, and they conversed upon that subject while ascending the snowy mountain. A lawman insinuated that Dutch had conveniently vilified the natives by association. Marston suspected the law didn't need an excuse to have hated them already with the tools their privileges had given them. Well, the posse blew up that gate and they struggled to fight up a hill into that bandit castle. One of the marshals spied a machine gun and, knowing of Marston's prowess with the infernal technologies, commanded him to man it. Marston proceeded to paint that fort the color of bullet holes. Dutch appeared on a dramatic terrace and delivered a shouting loud soliloquy. Marston went after him with all he could. During his desperation to escape, Dutch had perpetrated the classical mistake of climbing up until the only place left to go was down. Marston pointed a pistol while Dutch wrote his own eulogy out loud and unarmed. Dutch said, "We can't always fight nature. We can't fight nothing." He said when he was dead, the peacemakers would find another monster. Marston hesitated. Probably he loved this man who was about to die whether he killed him or not. Dutch left this planet on his own terms. Marston climbed down to have a reckon of his mentor's corpse. One of the Federals chided him for his hesitation on the cliff. He asked Marston to give him his gun. The Federal put a bullet in Dutch's corpse. He said it'd look better on the report. As you and I both know, the history books more often than not tell us the facts of what happened most of the time, and the nuance of those facts quite seldom. Hesitating to shoot Dutch up on that cliff might have been the last time John Marston hesitated in his life. He got on his old horse and immediately rode back to his old farm. Turns out it wasn't that far away. His wife Abigail and his son Jack were waiting for him. Without a hesitation, he put himself right back into family life. He made good on his promise to old Bonnie McFarlane and bought some cattle from her ranch. He drove the herd to his own farm. He grew crops. He owned horses.
Sorry you had to see that, son.
He buried himself in his ordinary day-to-day tasks like shooting thieving ravens circling the corn silo. He taught his boy how to hunt elk. He told his boy their life was going to go back to normal, and his boy questioned what normal meant for a man like him. Marston didn't have an easy answer. Well, together they killed some elk, and later they went out and shot some wolves. One day his son talked about flying machines he'd read about in the newspapers and said, "Those machines can turn men into angels." John Marston repeated this expression, "Machines can turn men into angels," with a tone of voice like he was judging neither men nor angels. He wrangled wild horses with his old uncle, and no matter how much that old uncle talked back, he didn't say a word about the nasty tobacco stain in that old man's beard. In the twin interests of friendship and hunger, Bonnie McFarlane offered to buy some corn from John Marston, so Marston and his wife Abigail rode off to McFarlane's ranch. Abigail and Bonnie bonded over stories about John, and when John left, Bonnie stared down the road for a while. She'd tell somebody later she had some notion that that was the last time she'd ever see him, but maybe she didn't have such a notion at all. I say there's only so much anybody knows, and most of the time what we do know got nothing to do with other people.
Ma'am?
On one of the last days of John Marston's life, John Marston's son, young Jack Marston, got to thinking he could hunt a bear by himself, and he ran off. John went out to the rescue. Seems the boy had forgotten you're to point a gun and pull the trigger. John and Jack rode back home together on one horse. John told his son not to be in a hurry to grow up. He told his son not to grow up to be like him in any case. Maybe if John Marston had had a few more weeks on Earth, a few more days would have presented enough more opportunities for him to repeat this lesson enough times for his boy to believe it. That last day of John Marston's life, the Federals came. They projected no shadow before their horses as they rode. They spoke no words that explained their reason. It might have been they wanted to eliminate the evidence of the dirtiness about their having killed Dutch, or it might have just been they were enacting what the book says about the past not being done with us even when we're done with the past. As though in a rage against all the bad he'd done in his life, John Marston fought to protect his family in the end like a true cowboy. He put them on a horse and he urged them away. As you and I can only dream to, he utilized his final breath toward the extermination of several of his oppressors. Later, his wife and boy rode back to find him there face up in the dirt, red, dead, and redeemed. They buried him with a quote from scripture that the peacemakers are blessed, though it might have been neither of them knew blessed by whom. 3 years later, maybe to the day, Abigail Marston died too, and there was young Jack Marston, a man grown now, the leavings of a glue-wet rat on the bottom of his own face. Now, nobody I ever heard of ever had the occasion or the opportunity to ask young Jack Marston what exactly was on his mind when he did what it was he did next. Maybe he was thinking about how his dead daddy had said don't be in a hurry to grow up and not be like him, and maybe Jack was aware of all that talk of free will's identity as hogwash. Maybe young Jack Marston knew he was tied to the destiny of an outlaw's sorrowful existence by a chain stronger than steel and longer than time, because he saddled up that farm's oldest nag, pointed its nose west, and rode with a killer's grimace directly into the ocean, which swallowed him up and he died. And well, that's the story behind and the origin of the old saying about how one can possess the sense of direction to guide a horse toward a body of water. However, one can't rightly say whether that horse is going to get any of that water in its stomach or not.